IBESS, Environmental Value Systems Part 4, will examine the historical events and influences that served to develop environmental consciousness. The significant idea is historical events, among other influences, affect the development of environmental value systems and environmental movements. Henry David Thoreau was an American author, poet, and philosopher. Thoreau was a leading transcendentalist. Transcendentalism had a core belief in the inherent goodness of both people and nature. Transcendentalists believed that society and its institutions ultimately corrupted the purity of the individual, and it had faith that people are at their best when truly self-reliant and independent. Thoreau is best known for his book Walden, which is a reflection upon simple living in natural surroundings. He wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." Here's an image of Walden Pond. It's important for me to note that as a boy I took swimming lessons here. Thoreau wrote, "Most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life are not only indispensable but positive hindrances to the elevation of life. Men have become tools of their tools." There could not be a more accurate description of today's world. Yellowstone National Park in the United States was signed into law by Ulysses S. Grant in 1872. Yellowstone was the first national park in the world. This was the first legal act to protect wilderness. The Grand Canyon National Park became a legal entity in 1919, the 15th national park in the U.S. U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt visited the Grand Canyon in 1903 and said, "The Grand Canyon fills me with awe. It is beyond comparison, beyond description, absolutely unparalleled throughout the wide world. Let this great wonder of nature remain as it now is. Do nothing to mar its grandeur, sublimity, and loveliness. You cannot improve on it, but what you can do is to keep it for your children, your children's children, and all who come after you, as the one great sight which every American should see. Leave it as it is. The ages have been at work on it, and man can only mar it." Roosevelt also wrote, "While my interest in natural history has added very little to my sum of achievement, it has added immeasurably to my sum of enjoyment in life. We are prone to speak of the resources of this country as inexhaustible. This is not so." John Muir founded the Sierra Club as an environmental organization in May of 1892 in San Francisco, California. The club was one of the first large-scale environmental preservation organizations in the world. You can hear the ecocentrist attitudes in John Muir's writings. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play and pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul. In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks. Keep close to nature's heart, and break clear away once in a while, and climb a mountain, or spend a week in the woods. Wash your spirit clean. John Muir's conservation efforts were focused on Yosemite National Park. At the time, the city of San Francisco, rebuilding after the devastating 1906 earthquake, was arguing in favor of the construction of a dam in one of Yosemite's valleys. The dam's reservoir of water would provide water and electricity. At congressional hearings, supporters of the dam argued that conservation of natural resources was best achieved through management of the wilderness. Muir argued that the Hetch Hetchy Valley was a grand landscape garden, one of nature's rarest and most precious mountain temples. In the end, Congress chose management over aesthetics, voting to allow the Hetch Hetchy Dam on federal land. Here is the Hetch Hetchy Valley with the dam as seen today. Muir wrote in 1912, "God has cared for these trees, saved them from drought, disease, avalanches, and 1,000 tempests and floods, but he cannot save them from fools." The passenger pigeon seen here is an extinct species of pigeon that was endemic to North America. Passenger pigeons were hunted by Native Americans, but hunting intensified after the arrival of Europeans, particularly in the 19th century. The extinction of the passenger pigeon aroused public interest in the conservation movement and resulted in new laws and practices which prevented many other species from becoming extinct. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s in the Midwest U.S. was a period of severe dust storms brought on by drought and intensive farming methods. Intensive farming as a human activity resulted in a loss of topsoil that forced tens of thousands of farming families to abandon their farms. Farmers had conducted extensive deep plowing of the native topsoil of the Great Plains during the 1920s. The deep plowing displaced the native deep-rooted grasses that normally held the soil. The mechanization of farm equipment, especially small tractors, also contributed to the decline of native grasslands. Dust Bowl conditions affected 100 million acres. An awareness that human activities were negatively impacting the environment was growing. But as World War II ended, economies boomed, growth seemed unlimited, and food production increased due to Green Revolution techniques. It was a time of economic exuberance, and people worried little about the environment. Instead of learning from the mistakes of the Dust Bowl, where intensive farming damaged the topsoil, the Green Revolution increased the trend toward intensive farming. The Green Revolution employed new high-yielding varieties of seed in association with chemical fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, along with a controlled water supply, usually involving irrigation. There were new methods of cultivation, including mechanization. All of these together were seen as a package of practices to supersede traditional technology and to be adopted as a whole. The Green Revolution, led by Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, was credited with saving over 1 billion people from starvation. But intensive farming has had dramatic environmental impact. With the end of the Second World War, the world's population grew, food production grew, industry increased, and there was economic euphoria. Populations around the world were growing. Science and technology were viewed as having solutions to all problems, including environmental issues. The agro-industrial complex became popular. The world's resources appeared abundant. Even in Russia, the trend toward the modern industrial complex was seen in a positive light. This propaganda poster from the 1950s in Russia says, "The smoke from chimneys is the breath of Russia." The post-war economic euphoria prevented people from seeing the environmental damage caused by industry. But various thinkers, philosophers, and writers were beginning to sound the alarm. Aldo Leopold wrote a Sand County Almanac in 1949, 5 years after the end of the Second World War. Leopold wrote about the ethical responsibility toward nature. He was the first to use the term stewardship when referring to the relationship between people and the earth. Here are some Leopold quotes. Listen carefully. "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Conservation is a state of harmony between men and land. We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." Then in 1956, 1957, in Minamata, Japan, many people were dying from a mysterious disease. The cause of the deaths was determined to be mercury poisoning. A chemical factory had been releasing mercury into the local water, and mercury had entered the food chain. Mercury accumulated in the cells and tissues of the algae and zooplankton in the water, and then magnified in concentration through the food chain. Notice the increase in concentration from one trophic level to the next. Organisms at the top of the food chain suffered the most due to the high concentrations of mercury, the magnification of mercury concentrations through the food chain. Minamata mercury poisoning was one of the first events where modern industrial practices caused direct harm to people's health. In 1962, Rachel Carson wrote a book titled Silent Spring. Carson speculated that DDT, an insecticide used on farm fields, had entered the human food chain, causing cancer. While Carson did not have significant evidence of DDT's ill effects on human health, her book was widely read and sounded the alarm. Two other books appeared in succession by Edward Abbey. In Desert Solitaire, Abbey critiqued modern Western civilization, United States politics, and the decline of America's environment. Desert Solitaire would eventually be recognized as an iconic work of nature writing and a staple of early environmentalists. In Monkey Wrench Gang, a novel, Abbey tells a story of the use of sabotage to protest environmentally damaging activities in the southwest United States. The book was so influential that the term monkey wrench has come to mean any sabotage, activism, or law breaking to preserve wilderness, wild spaces, and ecosystems. In 1971, the non-governmental organizations Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth were formed. Media attention to environmental issues increased. Public awareness of environmental issues increased. Save the Whale campaign was initiated. The use of DDT as an insecticide was banned in the U.S. in 1972. In the 1970s, an organized resistance to the destruction of forests spread throughout India and came to be known as the Chipko movement. The name of the movement comes from the word embrace, as the villagers hugged the trees and prevented the contractors from felling them. The Chipko movement inspired many eco-groups, and this slowed the rate of deforestation. The Chipko movement was a rallying point for many environmental movements all over the world, but it created a precedent for nonviolent environmental protest, and it occurred at a time when there was hardly any environmental movement in the developing world. In 1973, CITES was passed. CITES is the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. CITES was formed by IUCN. It's a UN body, International Union for the Conservation of Nature. 173 countries signed the CITES agreement. CITES restricts the trade of endangered species. In 1979, James Lovelock proposed the concept of Gaia. He proposed that the Earth was a self-regulating, homeostatic organism, a system where living organisms on Earth have changed Earth to make Earth more suitable for living organisms, and so on, with negative feedback control. In 1983, the UN General Assembly published the Bruntland Report, which, for the first time, defined sustainability or sustainable development, and it did so as development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. You should hear the anthropocentric tone here. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Then, in 1984, there was the Bhopal disaster. In Bhopal, India, the Union Carbide factory released toxic gases, pesticide with cyanide. Over 500,000 people were exposed, and upwards of 22,000 people died. Union Carbide did not respond to a court summons and eventually closed its doors. Bought by another company, Union Carbide's responsibility for the Bhopal disaster has not been resolved in a satisfactory manner. In 1986, in Chernobyl, Ukraine, a nuclear power plant had a meltdown in the nuclear core, releasing radioactive gases across northeastern Europe. The Chernobyl disaster resulted in 4,000 deaths immediately, with total deaths possibly reaching 30,000. The Chernobyl disaster was the worst nuclear power plant accident in history in terms of cost and casualties. It is one of only 2 nuclear disasters classified as a Level 7 event, the maximum classification on the International Nuclear Event Scale. In this photograph, you can see workers maintaining the closed reactor in 2006. Construction crews work in high radiation levels to strengthen the crumbling sarcophagus that covers the Chernobyl nuclear power station's damaged reactor number 4. The crews can only work from 4 to 15 minutes because of the high level of radiation still emanating from the reactor. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol was signed to reduce CFC emissions. CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, were found to deplete the ozone layer located in the stratosphere. Stratospheric ozone prevents UV wavelengths from reaching the surface of the Earth. The depletion of stratospheric ozone was allowing high UV radiation in certain regions on Earth. CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, originate from industrial solvents, aerosol cans, refrigerants such as air conditioners, and in the manufacture of package materials, foams. The Montreal Protocol has been one of the most important and successful international agreements. Once enacted, CFC production declined. CFCs remain in use, but the Montreal Protocol has reduced the production and use of CFCs worldwide. The Rio Earth Summit of 1992 was a conference involving 172 governments. The Rio Earth Summit was the first conference to examine the prospect of alternative sources of energy to replace the use of fossil fuels, which the delegates linked to global climate change. The summit led to an agreement on climate change known as the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. Another Rio 1992 agreement was to not carry out any activities on the lands of indigenous peoples that would cause environmental degradation or that would be culturally inappropriate. And lastly, the Rio 1992 summit included the Convention on Biological Diversity. The Convention on Biological Diversity had as its objective the development of national strategies for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. The 1996-97 Kyoto Protocol on climate change was initiated at the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. Signatories agreed to reduce carbon dioxide emissions certain percentages below 1990 levels. The Kyoto Protocol was a failure because the largest carbon dioxide emitters, for example the United States, did not sign. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations have continued to increase over time. The world does not appear ready to divorce itself from fossil fuel use, and every day we're having conversations about climate change. In 2010, in the Gulf of Mexico, the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill released 4.9 million barrels of oil into the water. It is considered the largest accidental marine oil spill in the history of the petroleum industry. A massive response ensued to protect beaches, wetlands, and estuaries from the spreading oil. Due to the months-long spill, along with adverse effects from the cleanup activities, extensive damage to marine and wildlife habitats, and fishing, and tourism industries was reported. In 2013, 3 years later, 4.6 million pounds of oily material was removed from the beaches of Louisiana. In 2013, it was reported that dolphins and other marine life continued to die in record numbers, with infant dolphins dying at 6 times the normal rate. In 2011, another nuclear accident shook the world. The Fukushima Nuclear Power Plant in Fukushima, Japan, released radioactive gases. The meltdown of the reactor was initiated by a tsunami following the Tohoku earthquake. Radioactive gases spread east across the Pacific over the days that followed the meltdown of the Fukushima reactor. Despite all of the environmental degradation caused by human activities, and despite all of the environmental awareness, humans still emit billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. The world burns 85 million barrels of oil every day. The 2015 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP21, was held in Paris, France. It was the 21st session of the Conference of Parties since the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The conference negotiated the Paris Agreement, a global agreement on the reduction of climate change, the text of which represented a consensus of the 196 parties attending the conference. The agreement will become legally binding if joined by at least 55 countries, which together represent at least 55% of global greenhouse emissions. On 22 April 2016, Earth Day, 174 countries signed the agreement in New York and began adopting it within their own legal systems. And that brings us to the end of IBESS Environmental Values Part 4. Hopefully this movie provided an historical context for environmental thinking and environmental movements today.